Hello, everyone.
Have you ever caught yourself feeling something you knew you shouldn't? That forbidden kind of feeling, the one that makes your mind scream, stop. But your heart keeps pulling you deeper, as if it's no longer yours to control? That's exactly what happened to me. It was supposed to be a simple weekend visit to my mom's place, something I'd done countless times before. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. And for most of the day, it was exactly that, ordinary. Until the evening came, and everything changed. I was standing in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water when he walked in. Mark. My mom's new husband. He moved with that quiet confidence older men have, the kind that makes it impossible not to notice them. Our eyes met for a brief second, but it was long enough for something inside me to shift. His gaze didn't just glance over me, it lingered. Not long enough to be obvious, but enough to send a jolt of something forbidden coursing through my veins. I tried to focus on my water, but my hand trembled slightly, and a few drops spilled onto the counter. Get a grip, I told myself, but it didn't help. Especially not when he took a step closer. You okay? He asked, his voice low, smooth, and far too calm for what I was feeling inside. I nodded quickly, maybe too quickly. Yeah, just tired, I muttered, avoiding his gaze. But I could still feel his eyes on me, and it made my pulse quicken in a way I didn't want to admit. He didn't move away. Instead, he leaned slightly against the counter, far too close for comfort. Or maybe too close for my sanity, because comfort was the last thing I felt. Long day, he asked, his tone casual, but there was something beneath it, something unspoken. Yeah, I replied, barely managing to keep my voice steady. I guess I didn't sleep well last night. He smiled, that kind of knowing smile that made my stomach tighten. Maybe tonight will be better, he said, his eyes holding mine for a moment too long before he finally stepped back, giving me just enough space to breathe again. But the damage was already done. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't name. I left the kitchen as fast as I could without making it obvious. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts I didn't want to have. This is ridiculous, I told myself. He's your mom's husband. You're imagining things. He's just being friendly. But no matter how many times I repeated it, that tension lingered, clawing at the back of my mind. Later that night, I sat in the living room, pretending to scroll through my phone while my mom went to bed. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the TV I wasn't really watching. I told myself I'd stay up for a bit, unwind, and then head to bed. I didn't expect Mark to walk in. Still awake, he asked, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced up, my heart doing that stupid fluttering thing again. Yeah, couldn't sleep. He nodded, walking over to the armchair across from me. Mind if I join you? I should have said something. I should have made an excuse and gone to bed. But instead, I just shrugged, trying to act indifferent. Sure. He sat down, and for a few moments, we just sat there in silence. But it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence. It was heavy, charged with something I couldn't ignore. You know, he said after a while, his voice quieter now, more intimate. It's nice having you here. Your mom's always happier when you visit. Thanks, I said, trying to keep my tone light, but the words felt awkward in my mouth. I didn't know what to say, because nothing about this felt normal anymore. Another silence followed, and I found myself wishing he would leave. Not because I didn't want him there, but because I did. And that terrified me. I should probably head to bed, I said abruptly, standing up before I could second-guess myself. He looked up at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in his eyes, something I didn't want to name. Good night, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my breath hitch. I hurried upstairs, closing the door behind me and leaning against it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't know if it was fear or something else. Something I didn't want to admit. I tried to tell myself that nothing had happened, that I was overthinking it. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. Not even close. And what scared me the most was that a part of me didn't want it to be. The next morning, I tried to act like nothing happened. Like last night was just nothing. Mom bustled around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast, while I sat quietly at the table, poking at my food with a fork. I could feel him nearby, even without looking. Mark sat across from me, calm, composed, like nothing was out of the ordinary. But I felt everything. Every movement he made, every glance he gave, even when I wasn't watching. "So, you have plans today?" Mom asked cheerfully as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, I think I'll just walk around town for a bit," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my voice felt tight. I could barely lift my eyes from the table. Mark didn't say anything, but I felt his gaze linger on me for a fraction longer than it should have. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. Enough to remind me that something between us had shifted. He was waiting for something. Maybe a moment when we'd be alone again. I finished my breakfast quickly, excusing myself with some vague reason about needing fresh air. As soon as I stepped outside, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The air was cool and crisp, but it did little to calm the storm inside me. I started walking aimlessly, hoping that the quiet streets would help clear my mind. But it didn't help. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape my thoughts. Mark's eyes, his voice, that moment in the kitchen, it all played over and over in my head. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was all in my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth, something had changed, and pretending otherwise wasn't going to make it go away. I found myself wandering into a small park, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the ground, lost in thought. I hated how much space he was taking up in my mind. I hated that I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the way his presence had made my heart race. This wasn't right. It couldn't be. But no matter how many times I told myself that, the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. More intense. Like some invisible thread was pulling me toward him, whether I wanted it or not. I stayed out as long as I could, trying to avoid going back home. But eventually, as the afternoon turned to evening, I knew I couldn't stay out forever. With a deep breath, I got up from the bench and started walking back. The tension that had settled in my chest during breakfast returned with every step I took toward the house. I wasn't ready to face him again, but I didn't have a choice. When I walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Mom was nowhere to be seen, probably upstairs resting. And there, standing in the kitchen, was Mark. Alone. Our eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, the air felt heavier. Neither of us said anything, but the silence spoke louder than any words could. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just go straight to my room. But before I could make a decision, he spoke. "Good walk?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Yeah," I replied quickly, hoping my voice didn't betray the nerves I felt. I moved toward the stairs, desperate to escape the tension. "I'm just gonna go upstairs." But as I turned, I heard him take a step closer. "Hey, if you ever want to talk, you know you can, right?" His voice was soft, almost caring. I froze for a moment, my hand gripping the banister tightly. There was nothing wrong with what he said. It was innocent enough. But the way he said it, the way his voice lingered on the words, made my heart race all over again. Without turning around, I nodded quickly. "Thanks. I'll keep that in mind." And with that, I rushed up the stairs, closing the door to my room behind me. I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to break free. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. But it didn't matter how wrong it was, the tension between us was real. It was undeniable. And worst of all, I didn't want it to stop. And that was only the beginning. What happened after that? Trust me, things got even more intense and way more complicated. You won't believe how far it went. That evening, I came home as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a dim glow across the living room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Mom had already gone to bed. She had a habit of turning in early, especially after long days. I thought about heading straight to my room, locking the door, and shutting myself off from the world. But something stopped me. Or rather, someone. Mark was in the living room, sitting on the couch with the TV on. He wasn't really watching it. The faint sound of a news program played in the background, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were on me, even before I noticed him. I hesitated in the doorway for a second too long, feeling the tension build like static in the air. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, but there was something else beneath it, something I couldn't ignore. "You're back." "Yeah," I mumbled, walking over to the couch. I sat down on the far end, trying to put some distance between us, though it didn't help. The space felt non-existent, like the air between us was charged with something I didn't want to name. "You were out for a while," he said, keeping his eyes on me. His tone was light, almost conversational, but it carried an undertone that made my pulse quicken. "I just needed some air," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. I hated how obvious my nervousness was, but there was nothing I could do about it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every second that passed felt heavier than the last. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the low murmur of the TV and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to focus on anything but him, but it was impossible. His presence was overwhelming, like gravity pulling me in, whether I wanted it or not. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something raw and unspoken. "About what?" I asked, turning to look at him despite myself. He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "About this." His eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I knew exactly what he meant, even though he didn't say it outright. "And the worst part?" I couldn't look away. "Mark, we can't," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. It was a feeble attempt at stopping something that already felt inevitable. "I know," he replied, his voice low and steady. "But it doesn't change the fact that it's already happening." His hand moved slightly, just enough to brush against mine. It was the smallest touch, barely more than a graze, but it sent a jolt through me like electricity. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to put an end to this before it went any further. But my body betrayed me, staying perfectly still, frozen in place by a mix of fear and something far more dangerous, desire. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. "This is wrong," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I know," he said again, his voice softer this time, almost apologetic. "But tell me, does it feel wrong to you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew the truth. It didn't feel wrong. It felt terrifying, exhilarating, and completely out of control, but not wrong. And that scared me more than anything. He leaned in slightly, closing the small gap between us, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "We don't have to do anything," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "Just tell me to stop, and I will." I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. The air between us felt too thick, too heavy, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I knew I should tell him to stop. I knew I should get up and walk away. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed right where I was, frozen in place by the intensity of the moment. His hand moved again, this time more deliberately, his fingers brushing over mine in a way that made my breath hitch. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like the crossing of a line we could never uncross. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." "I know," he whispered, his eyes never leaving mine. "But that doesn't change how I feel." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The tension was unbearable, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap at any second. I knew that if I didn't get up and leave now, something was going to happen. Something I couldn't take back. But before I could make a decision, he leaned in even closer, his face just inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and inviting, and it made my head spin. "Tell me to stop," he said again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And I will." I should have said it. I should have told him to stop. But instead, I closed the remaining distance between us, letting our lips meet in a kiss that was as inevitable as it was forbidden. The moment our lips touched, everything else faded away. The world outside ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the heat between us, the overwhelming intensity of a moment we both knew we shouldn't be having. His hand moved to my face, gently cupping my cheek, and I felt myself leaning into his touch, unable to resist the pull any longer. It was wrong. We both knew it. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the way he made me feel alive, exhilarated, and completely out of control. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our hearts racing in sync. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice full of guilt and something else, something I didn't want to name. I shook my head, unable to find the right words. I wasn't sorry. Not in the way I should have been. And that terrified me. The days that followed were pure torture. We barely spoke, but the silence between us was charged with something I couldn't ignore. Every accidental touch, every fleeting glance, it all brought me back to that night in the living room, to the line we had crossed but never acknowledged. I tried to avoid him, to put distance between us. But no matter how hard I tried, it felt impossible. He was always there, in the house, in my thoughts, in the tension that clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. Mom seemed oblivious to everything. She carried on as usual, unaware of the war raging inside me. Every time she smiled at Mark or kissed him on the cheek, guilt clawed at my insides. I kept telling myself that I needed to stop this before it went too far, before it became something I couldn't undo. But a part of me, the part one hated to admit existed, didn't want to stop. It wanted more. One evening, after another long day of tiptoeing around each other, I found myself alone in the kitchen. Mom had gone to bed early again, and the house was wrapped in an unsettling stillness. I poured myself a glass of wine, hoping it would help ease the tension inside me. But as I sat at the table, swirling the deep red liquid in my glass, I heard footsteps approaching. Mark. I didn't look up as he entered the kitchen, but my fingers tightened around the stem of the glass. I could feel him watching me as he walked over and took a seat across from me. The air grew heavier with each passing second, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the wine, pretending that his presence didn't affect me. "Want to talk?" he asked quietly, his voice soft and almost hesitant. I glanced up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time that evening. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something that mirrored the turmoil I was feeling. "I don't know what I want," I admitted honestly, my voice barely above a whisper. And it was true. I was torn between the desire to walk away and the overwhelming urge to step closer, to see where this would lead. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Neither do I," he said, his voice just as soft. "But we can't keep pretending this isn't happening." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we could pretend, that we had to. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. "What do you expect me to say?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "That I don't think about it? That I don't feel this?" I gestured vaguely between us, my hand trembling slightly. "Because I do. And I hate myself for it." His eyes darkened slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might reach across the table and take my hand. But he didn't. He just sat there, watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said quietly. I know how complicated this is. But I also know that ignoring it won't make it go away. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. He was right. Ignoring it hadn't worked. Avoiding him hadn't worked. Nothing had worked, because the tension between us was still there, growing stronger with each passing day. What are we supposed to do then? I asked, my voice trembling. Just give in to it? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he admitted finally. But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either. His honesty was both terrifying and liberating. For so long, I had been trying to convince myself that this was all in my head, that it was just a fleeting infatuation. But hearing him say it out loud, acknowledging that he felt it too, made it impossible to deny. I can't do this, I whispered, more to myself than to him. I can't be that person. You're not that person, he said firmly. You didn't choose this. Neither of us did. But it's here, and we have to figure out what to do about it. Silence settled over us once again, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of avoidance. It was something more raw, more honest. I took a slow sip of my wine, trying to steady my nerves. What if we ruin everything? I asked quietly, my eyes fixed on the dark liquid in my glass. What if this ruins us? We're already ruined, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my chest ache. At least, I am. Because I can't stop thinking about you. And no matter how wrong it is, I don't want to. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I wanted to be angry at him, to blame him for making this harder. But I couldn't, because I felt the same way. And that was the worst part. I finished my wine in silence, the tension between us growing with each passing second. When I set my glass down, he stood up slowly, walking around the table until he was standing beside me. My heart pounded in my chest as he reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. We don't have to figure this out tonight, he said quietly, his hand lingering near my face. But we can't keep running from it either. I looked up at him, my breath catching in my throat. His eyes held mine, filled with a mix of desire and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I should go to bed, I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. Okay, he replied, stepping back slightly. But he didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me as I got up from the table and walked toward the stairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back down at him. He was still standing in the kitchen, his eyes following me, and for a brief moment, I wondered what would have happened if I had stayed. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Not even close. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The only question now was, how far would we go? Stay with me, because things were about to get even more complicated. It happened faster than I ever imagined. One moment, we were standing there, too close, the tension thick enough to drown in. The next, I felt his hand on my cheek, warm, steady, making it impossible to breathe. I closed my eyes, the heat of his touch clouding every rational thought I had left. We shouldn't, I whispered, but even to my own ears, my words sounded hollow, weak. I didn't want him to stop. And he knew it. He could hear the lie in my voice as clearly as I could feel the pounding of my heart. Mark leaned in, closing the last bit of distance between us, and then our lips met. Soft, slow at first, but quickly unraveling into something we couldn't control. It was wrong. We both knew it. But at that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. Time blurred. The world outside didn't exist. There was only us, lost in something we couldn't undo. His hands on me, my heart racing, my mind screaming to stop while my body betrayed me entirely. And when it was over, the silence that followed was louder than anything else. I lay there afterward, staring at the ceiling, too stunned to move. Guilt mixed with a twisted sense of satisfaction, clashing inside me like a storm. I hated what we'd done, but I hated even more how much I wanted to do it again. Mark didn't say a word. He got up, dressed quietly, and left the room, leaving me alone with my spiraling thoughts. I should have felt relieved when he walked out, but instead, all I felt was emptiness, and the terrifying realization that this wasn't the end. Not for me. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal. I smiled, made small talk, went through the motions of breakfast with Mom like nothing had happened. She had no idea, of course. She laughed, sipped her coffee, and gave Mark a casual kiss on the cheek before heading out to run errands. Meanwhile, I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, feeling like I was slowly unraveling. Mark barely looked at me. Whether it was guilt or something else, I couldn't tell. But that tension, the thing we'd tried so hard to ignore before, it was still there. Stronger than ever. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted it to go away. I spent the rest of the day pretending I was fine. Pretending I didn't care. But every time I caught a glimpse of him, every accidental brush of our hands, it all came rushing back, the heat, the thrill, the overwhelming desire. I told myself it had to end. That it would end. But deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't want it to. And that's how it happened. That's how one moment changed everything. What came next? That's a story for another time. But now, I want to know, what would you have done? Would you have stopped it before it began, or would you have crossed the line too? Let me know in the comments. I need to hear it. Because honestly, I still don't know if I regret it.
Bye.